The first time I met Suzie Dawson was at Occupy Auckland protests. She was active, very active in making the protest movement known to everybody. Suzie was very active in the media side of things, very good at getting the message out and communicating with other people what the Occupy movement was about, which of course made her high profile quite quickly. Several of us there sort of did quite a lot of public sort of face stuff, and Suzie was certainly amongst them. The problem was that once we became once it was visible to the people that were watching us that we were actually important in keeping the group together and functioning well and getting the message out, we were targeted for special attention. At protests, I was arrested more times than anybody else ever because my name was known, and Suzie was the same. Suzie's name was known. She was effective and good at what she did, which was getting the message out and communicating, and that made her a terrible threat to the powers that be. They were trying to paint the movement as full of lunatics, and we weren't, and Suzie clearly got that message through. So she got special attention from the police. I got special attention. You couldn't deny it. Our houses were broken into, our cars were messed with, our lives were messed with. Suzie was driven out of New Zealand. I was driven out of Auckland. I know, and she was targeted far more than I was. The reason she's not in New Zealand is because she wasn't safe here. She was targeted here, and her life and her children's lives were threatened. At the height of our protesting, when things were quite heated, Suzie often had her house broken into, interfered with. She was followed around by people when she was driving and walking around town, and it's a horrible, frightening thing. Firstly, you don't know, and she didn't know what was happening. It's just odd things start to happen. You can't think of why they are happening, but they are. You start telling people what's happening, and they start thinking you're crazy. And that's how it works. It makes you feel very vulnerable when they hold all the cards, when they are tampering with your house, when they are tampering with your phone and you're watching you, and putting things on the internet about you and your family and making you unsafe. And it was certainly happening. It certainly was. It was a frightening time for all of us. There was an incident after she left my house one night. It was horrible. She had the kids in the car and it was dark and she was on her way home, and she was monstered on the road. The same thing happened to my partner and I when we were travelling, and from the sounds of it, exactly the same thing. Two cars travelling, boxing her in and trying to force her off the road. She rang very concerned about that, and you know, I know how scary that is because that's happened to us too. The incident that I refer to, but that happened to me, was I was travelling on the same piece of road. It's a dark and twisty piece of road, and we'd pulled into a gas station and noticed a car had stopped close to us and nobody had gotten out, which was peculiar. So when we left, we did a little maneuver that put us behind the guy, because as soon as we started to move out, the guy in the car park started to move out too, and he thought we were going to head north again, and we didn't. We pretended to head south and ended up behind him. So further up the road, we were behind and could see him, and he was getting slower and slower. And then there was another car behind us that forced it, that came up behind us and forced us into a situation where we were between the two cars. And it was only that we braked heavily and ducked in behind them and took off, that we weren't boxed in and forced into the corner. And that sounds very like the incident that happened to Suzie, the same piece of road, more or less. Suzie talks about people entering a house, and the same thing happened to me. I live in a rural situation along a busy road, and I am very careful to make sure when I go out, I shut all the doors, because I have pets that I don't want to get run over. Well, I went out and I was only out an hour or so, and when I came back, the garage where the dogs were, all 3 doors were open, including the big heavy tilter door at the front. And one of my dogs had been run over and killed. And there's no way that could happen without somebody coming and doing it. And who would do that? You know, I mean, the thing is, you can't prove who did it, but it was definitely done. You know when someone's been in your house and they do come into your house. It's very scary. Susie's work was of significance because Suzie talked to people who were of significance. She was talking to Kim.com and Honi Harawira and talking about things like Edward Snowden and people who were important and people who were um, threats to people in power. And that made her very important. She was sharing information from these very high profile people. So her work was very important here. The idea that there's any benefit to anyone from pretending that you've been targeted by your government is a bit peculiar. There's no way you can make money out of being targeted and being an exile in a foreign country where you don't know anyone and you're far away from all of your support. It's not anything anybody would choose. It's something that you're driven to. I am in sort of a similar situation in that I can't live in the city of my choice anymore. I was driven out of Auckland in the same way that Suzie was driven even further. I mean, I don't have kiddies, so I didn't have to go quite so far, but they definitely drive you out, and there's definitely no gain for anyone who's driven out of their hometown or home country. Certainly no financial gain. Some people say all sorts of things about people that they don't know. I know that Suzie's in Russia, and I know Suzie's children are with her. I have this dream that my friend Suzie is going to come back to New Zealand because I really miss her. But when I think about it seriously, I think that she's just going to come back to the same trouble she had when she left, because I don't think for one moment that Suzie's going to stop sharing information that she feels people need to hear. And I think that makes her a target to the New Zealand government, because there's a lot of things they don't want people to know. And I don't think that Suzie could come back to New Zealand safely. I think that she would be targeted again. And I don't mean just physically safely. She might be physically safe, but they'd certainly mess her up in every other way they possibly could, and life would be impossible for her here. If I think about how Suzie could have sought redress in New Zealand for the things that were happening to her, I sort of run through my mind who she could have gone to. Now, she did actually approach authorities to help her in some situations, and the police clearly were not on her side. I mean, clearly they were part of the problem. She did make a complaint about a couple of things to them, and they let it be known, they told her that they weren't going to help her. So if the police weren't going to help her, then what agency would? Um, they're doing something they don't want you to know they're doing, so they're not going to have an agency that's going to check on the covert operations. There's no redress that you could get here. The authorities that are doing it are the same ones you'd have to go to try and get some help, and they're not going to help you. So there is no recourse. Once you're a target in New Zealand, then the only way out is to get out, I think. There was a student protest in Simon Street, and I remember it very well because I'd arrived late and I'd purposely decided to stay out of the limelight because all I had to do was show my face to get arrested. So I was staying out of the firing line. Unfortunately, the cops had different ideas, and they maneuvered in such a way that I ended up in the front line with a circle of cops around about 100 of us, and they started pushing us and basically trying to get us to fall over backwards, which is quite painful. So we sat down. So then they proceeded to climb all over us to get at particular people that they were after, using a conga maneuver that because I was at the front, I was stood all over by these cops with their great big boots. They were then grabbing us, two cops grabbing a person, and I was one of them, and dragged and thrown on the ground, and then cable tied and thrown in a paddy wagon. But I've watched that video since, and the video's still on YouTube, and it shows what they were doing. One man was on the ground, and the two cops were practicing a technique I've seen them use of strangling somebody to unconsciousness. And you can see this young man that they've got their hands around. One cop's got his hands around this man's throat, and you see the man starting to froth and then starting to fit where the cops are trying to hide it, but somebody's filmed it and it's still there, and you can see he's actually unconscious and fitting before they let go of his throat. Now, I don't know, you've probably also seen they did the same thing to a young girl. She was about 18 or 19 in Aotea Square following a protest for TPPA, and they strangled her to unconsciousness and then carried her away unconscious to arrest her. It was appalling. I've seen some disgusting things. They picked my daughter up by the throat and lifted her off the ground. I was furious that night. Dreadful what they do, dreadful. The violence is just incredible. It's very difficult to exercise a right to protest safely in New Zealand, that's for sure. The incident where 4 cops were caught with the same badge number, Z557, definitely raised the profile of the whole Occupy movement and started to make the police look a little bit ugly. I'm quite sure that the authorities would have wanted us not to have exposed that, and having been successful, I'm sure they were quite angry with us and certainly wanted us shut down and made quiet somehow. The raid on Kim.com here coincided more or less, I think it was about a week or 2 weeks in between the evictions of the occupiers in Aotea Square. And I think that the reason that there were 4 cops there wearing Z557 badges is because they weren't really cops. They were people that had been there for Kim.com. And I think they felt as if that the Occupy movement was important enough that they shared some of their expertise from America in our protests as well. But there were odd people around, like the Thompson and Clark security were there, and I recognized some of them. But one of the people that stopped me he stopped me from going into a parking building with my car, so I couldn't get out of the car because I couldn't park it anywhere. But he leapt in front of me, and it was the middle of summer, it was January, and it was scorching hot. And the only reason I mention it is because the guy that leapt in front of me and flashed this badge at me was white as a ghost, and I thought he must have come from somewhere cold. He did not have a New Zealand tan, and I thought, well, they'd roped in some foreigners. See, I think that's what happened here. I think with Kim.com that the Americans took over, because it's not our style to helicopter raid somebody and, take guns in and stuff like that. I think that whole time period was a training ground to get our cops a bit more militarized. What happened to us high-profile occupiers, when Occupy actually was shut down and we did move from there, it became clear that some of us, our protesting hadn't ended with the movement, that Suzie was still involved in and even more involved in other issues that were important, and probably more important leading up to the 2014 election. She was still out there meeting New Zealand political figures, important political figures, and talking about things that the powers that be don't necessarily want us to talk about. And the Moment of Truth event, where so many important people were all brought together, and it was such a public forum with so much public support, clearly made Suzie a target to shut down. You know, the end of the Occupy movement didn't shut Suzie up and made her even more of a target, I think. The more you feel the pressure from authority to make you be quiet, to stop you from doing what you're doing, the more you feel the need to expose more truth and to fight against the system. So it becomes a bit of a tight spiral where the harder they push you, the harder you work, and the more they hate you, the more you become a target. It's a difficult thing because they've got all the power. In the end, they're the winners. You don't really have a lot of choice. You either give up or you die trying. I think one of the main things that probably was beginning to upset authority was the fact that there was a great deal of public support for some of the messages that we initially started to realise were happening because of Occupy. The surveillance of activists was pretty obvious, and the messing with activists was obvious, and it became important to people when they realised that there was an organisation within our own country that was potentially spying on absolutely everyone. And it was because of largely because of Suzie's media work that people even began to hear of GCSB. I mean, most of us didn't realise that there was an organisation that spied on us. But I think that thanks to her work, we all know exactly who's watching and why, when and why and how. And that, you know, the government doesn't want us to know how far their reach is. So they certainly wanted her to stop talking about that. I think the biggest danger of a movement like Occupy is that because we were well organised and because we had good reach and because we started to get a lot of public support, people began to pay attention more to things that were happening. Our marches were getting bigger and bigger, and people were getting more and more. The word is radicalised. People were beginning to start to say, well, things are not all right, and actually moving their asses into the streets. Well, they didn't really want us to continue with that kind of momentum, did they? Lots and lots and lots. It's like a snowball. A few people start to see things, and then you wake up and see a lot more things. And I think that the trouble with Suzie's following in New Zealand was that it was getting bigger and bigger. People were seeing more and more of the corruption that is our everyday life here.